quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in, let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. In the early Cold War, US intelligence leaders feared that hostile states were learning new ways to break prisoners and shape beliefs. Around that fear, a shadowy folklore grew fast. Stories of hypnotic assassins, programmed people, and even psychic style influence that could cross a room without a word. Some of those claims are fiction, some are exaggeration, but behind the myths sits a documented core that is disturbing enough. The CIA funded and ran a set of research efforts on interrogation, behavior, and drugs. The best documented program was called MK Ultra, approved in 1953 and managed inside the CIA Technical Services staff. It supported many subprojects at universities, hospitals, and prisons, often through cutouts that hid CIA sponsorship. Some work was framed as defense, how to resist coercion. Other work crossed ethical lines, including experiments with LSD and other drugs where people did not give informed consent. Many records were destroyed in 1973, leaving gaps where the strangest claims thrive, and where the truth is harder to pin down. Tonight, we go through Project MK Ultra Mind Control. You do not need to strain to hold the details. Let them arrive in a steady order, like folders placed one by one on a long table, each stamped with a date, each holding a small piece of the same uneasy question. When people say MK Ultra, they often imagine a single, clean plan. One program, one technique, one switch that turns a human mind into an obedient machine. The archive does not show that. The archive shows a bureaucracy. It shows worry, ambition, competition, and a willingness to take risks that should not have been taken. It shows many small projects, some overlapping, some contradictory, some clumsy, some dangerous. It shows a time when secrecy was treated like a shield that could justify almost anything. To keep our footing, we will separate what is strongly documented from what is claimed without solid support. We will name the dates that are known, the people who are known, the institutions that are known. We will also notice the silences, the missing pages, the places where later stories rush in to fill the empty space. This is not a story about magic mind control. It is a story about real attempts to influence and damage minds, carried out by people with government power in a climate of fear and rivalry. The roots of MK Ultra reach back before it was called that. During the Second World War, the United States built an intelligence service with a taste for unconventional tools. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, looked at sabotage, deception, and the psychology of enemies. After the war, the CIA was created in 1947. In the same years, the world split into competing blocs. The Soviet Union tightened control over Eastern Europe. China went through revolution and war. Then came the Korean War. American prisoners of war returned with stories that unsettled officials. Some prisoners had made confessions. Some had signed statements. Some appeared, at least in the public telling, to have been influenced by enemy interrogation. The word brainwashing entered American culture. It was not a scientific term. It was a political and emotional term, but it carried weight. Inside the CIA, leaders asked a simple question. If an enemy can shape a prisoner, can we defend against it? And if it can be done, can we do it too? In 1950 and 1951, the CIA began work under project names that came before MK Ultra. One early effort was called Bluebird. Another, related effort, was called Artichoke. These projects looked at interrogation methods and ways to control or influence behavior. They explored hypnosis, drugs, and other techniques. The goal was often phrased as a way to extract information, to induce cooperation, to create amnesia, to break resistance. Even at this early stage, the moral hazard was obvious. If you seek methods that can overpower a person, you will be tempted to test them on people who cannot refuse. If you are secretive, you will be tempted to hide the ugly parts. The name MK Ultra appears in 1953. On paper, it was approved on April 13th, 1953. The director of Central Intelligence at the time was Alan Dulles. The program was placed under the CIA Technical Services Staff, often called TSS. The man most tied to its day-to-day management was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who led the CIA's chemical and biological work in this area. Gottlieb was not the only person involved, but his name comes up again and again in the later record. He was the kind of official who could move between laboratories and policy meetings, between chemicals and budgets, between ideas and operations. MK Ultra was not one study. It was an umbrella. Under it were many subprojects. Some were inside CIA facilities. Many were outside, in universities and hospitals and private laboratories, funded through front organizations. The use of fronts is not a small detail. It matters because it shaped the ethics. If a researcher does not know the sponsor is the CIA, the researcher may not be able to judge the true purpose. If a subject does not know a study is connected to intelligence work, the subject cannot give informed consent. And if no one outside a narrow circle knows what is being done, oversight becomes weak or non-existent. When we talk about what is documented, we have to talk about where the documents come from. Much of what we know comes from several streams. One stream is the CIA itself, through internal memos and budget records that survived. Another stream is congressional investigation, especially the Church Committee in 1975, and later Senate hearings in 1977, led by Senator Edward Kennedy and others. Another stream is the Rockefeller Commission, a presidential commission created in 1975. Another stream is lawsuits, including cases brought by individuals and families, where discovery and testimony brought out more information. And then there is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. It did not open everything, but it forced some releases. In some cases, it forced the CIA to admit what it could not deny. But there is also a major hole. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of many MK Ultra records. This is not a rumor. It is a documented event. It means that much of the paper trail was intentionally erased. That act, the shredding and burning of records, became a seedbed for later claims. When the official file is gone, people project into the absence. Some projections are plausible, some are not, and some are shaped by fear and fiction. So we move carefully. We do not assume that every missing page hides a monster, but we also do not pretend that the surviving pages show everything. One of the most talked about parts of MK Ultra is LSD. In the early 1950s, LSD was a relatively new drug in the West. It was powerful. It could alter perception, mood, time sense. It could cause panic, confusion, or, in some cases, a kind of openness. For an intelligence service looking for tools, LSD looked like a possible truth serum or a disorienting agent. It also looked like a way to test the limits of a mind. The CIA obtained supplies of LSD and began experiments. Some were in controlled settings, some were not. The best known tragic case is the death of Frank Olson. Olson was a civilian scientist working with the US Army at Fort Detrick, connected to biological warfare research. In 1953, at a CIA retreat, he was given LSD without his knowledge. Days later, he fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. The official story long held that it was suicide. His family later challenged that. Decades later, the US government acknowledged that Olson had been given LSD without consent. His death became a symbol of the harm that could come from secret experiments. No matter what one believes about the details of Olson's final moments, the central fact remains clear. A person was drugged without consent by officials, and a person died soon after. The moral line was crossed. MK Ultra also included work on other drugs: barbiturates, amphetamines, mescaline, cannabis, and other substances were explored. The idea of a truth drug had been around for years. Sodium pentothal and similar drugs had been used in some interrogations. But none of these substances reliably force truth. Human beings can still lie while drugged, or can speak nonsense, or can be led by the questions. The archive shows a familiar pattern. The more officials hoped for a simple chemical key, the more the reality resisted them. Besides drugs, MK Ultra explored hypnosis. Hypnosis was attractive for several reasons. It could be used to induce relaxation or suggestibility. It could potentially create false memories or altered recall. It could potentially create amnesia for a period of time. It could potentially be used to plant a suggestion that would be acted on later. But hypnosis is not mind control in the way fiction presents it. People under hypnosis do not become robots. They remain influenced by their own values, fears, and expectations. Some people are more suggestible than others. The results are uneven. The CIA did not always accept those limits. Documents and later testimony show that some officials hoped for more than what the science could offer. The program also explored sensory deprivation. This is one of the darker threads because the effects are well known. When a human is placed in a situation with reduced sensory input or distorted input, the mind can become unstable. People can experience anxiety, hallucinations, disorientation, and a strong desire to escape. One of the names connected to sensory deprivation research is Donald Hebb at McGill University in Montreal. In the 1950s, Hebb and colleagues conducted experiments on sensory isolation, funded in part by a CIA-front organization. The subjects were often paid volunteers. The ethics were contested even then. The findings suggested that isolation could increase suggestibility and cause distress. Another Montreal connection is the psychiatrist Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute. Cameron carried out a set of treatments that included heavy drugging, sleep deprivation, and repeated recordings of messages, a technique sometimes called psychic driving. The aim was to break down and rebuild personality. Cameron's work has been linked to CIA funding through MK Ultra Subprojects. The extent and intent of that funding has been debated, but there is strong evidence of CIA support through fronts. Patients in Cameron's care suffered. Some lost memory. Some lost basic skills. Families later described severe damage. Lawsuits and inquiries brought attention to these events. Here, a careful line is needed. Cameron was a psychiatrist with his own theories and ambitions. He did not need CIA pressure to pursue aggressive treatments, but CIA funding helped support the work, and the CIA interest in breakdown and rebuilding fit the methods. The result, in any case, was harm to vulnerable people. Now we slow down and look at the structure of MKUltra. One reason it is hard to grasp is that it was spread across many subprojects. The CIA used a numbering system: Subproject 1, Subproject 2, and so on. Some subprojects were about drug testing. Some were about delivery methods, like aerosols or contaminated items. Some were about new chemicals. Some were about studies of personality, stress, and coercion. Some were about equipment and gadgets, because the technical services staff also developed disguise tools and surveillance tools. Not everything was mind control. Some was supporting tradecraft. But the mind and the body are not separate in such work. To control a mind, you often start by controlling the environment, the senses, the sleep, the pain. The term mind control is often used loosely. In a strict sense, mind control would mean a reliable method to force a person to think and act in a way that overrides their identity without their awareness and with predictable results. The archive does not show that MKUltra achieved such a method. What it does show is that officials explored ways to influence, confuse, weaken, and shape behavior under certain conditions. This difference matters. It keeps us from turning history into a myth. It also keeps us from minimizing harm. You do not need perfect control to cause deep damage. A person can be harmed by being drugged without consent. A person can be harmed by being isolated. A person can be harmed by being interrogated under coercion. A person can be harmed by being treated as a tool. And yet, in popular culture, MKUltra became a symbol of something bigger, a hidden machine that can program anyone, a secret force behind politics, a reason for every strange event. To understand how that happened, we need to follow the timeline into the 1960s and 1970s, when secrecy met scandal and fragments of truth met a public hungry for explanation. In the 1960s, the CIA faced pressure and change. The Bay of Pigs failed in 1961. The agency shifted leadership and priorities. At the same time, American society changed. Protest movements grew. Drug culture grew. LSD spread beyond laboratories. It is tempting to imagine that the CIA seeded the entire counterculture with LSD. Some people claim that. The documented record does show that the CIA distributed LSD in experiments. It does show that the CIA had access to large supplies. It does show that some early LSD researchers had contact with the agency. But it does not prove that the CIA controlled the entire cultural spread. LSD moved into public life through many paths. It was studied by psychiatrists. It was used by individuals seeking experience. It was promoted by figures like Timothy Leary. It was part of a wider shift. The CIA may have been one influence in a complex ecosystem, but not the only one, and not necessarily the central one. When we say grounded skepticism, this is what we mean. We do not deny that the CIA did troubling things. We also do not grant it unlimited power by default. Now, one of the most infamous operational pieces linked to MKUltra was called Operation Midnight Climax. The name itself sounds like fiction, and that is part of why it sticks. In the early 1960s, CIA operatives ran safe houses in San Francisco and other locations. Prostitutes were recruited to bring men to these apartments. The men were given drinks, sometimes laced with drugs, including LSD. CIA personnel observed behind one-way mirrors. The idea was to study how people behaved under drugs in a more natural environment, and possibly to explore ways to compromise targets. This is not rumor. It appears in the record, including in testimony. It is an example of how far the program moved away from any claim of purely defensive research. It is also an example of how secrecy can create a small world where moral judgment bends. If you imagine the people running those safe houses, you can almost feel the thin line between curiosity and cruelty. The subjects were not enemies on a battlefield. They were ordinary people pulled into a hidden experiment. And yet, within the logic of the time, this could be rationalized as necessary. The Cold War was invoked. The enemy was invoked. The need to stay ahead was invoked. This is how institutions commit wrongdoing. Not always through loud declarations of evil, but through quiet habits of justification. While MK Ultra ran, other agencies also explored similar themes. The US military had its own research programs. Universities had their own interests. Pharmaceutical companies developed new compounds. The boundary between intelligence research and broader scientific research was not always clear. In this period, the rules for human experimentation were weaker than today. There were ethical standards on paper, like the Nuremberg Code after World War II, but enforcement was inconsistent. Informed consent was not always respected, even in civilian contexts. MK Ultra exploited this weakness. It used the gaps. Now we come to a crucial moment. 1973. Richard Helms, leaving his position as CIA director, ordered the destruction of many MK Ultra records. This was later confirmed. Why were they destroyed? One answer is that officials feared exposure. They feared embarrassment. They feared legal consequences. They feared public outrage. Another answer is that they believed secrecy was still required. Whatever the mix of motives, the act had consequences. It made later oversight harder. It forced investigators to reconstruct the program from budget traces and surviving fragments. This is where one of the most important surviving sources comes in. Financial records. Even when memos are destroyed, money leaves tracks. In 1977, a cache of financial documents was discovered. These showed payments to institutions and researchers. They did not always describe the experiments in detail, but they confirmed the breadth of the program. This discovery helped spur further hearings and public understanding. Now, let the story breathe for a moment. It can feel overwhelming. Names, acronyms, subprojects, dates. You do not need to memorize. You only need to sense the shape. The shape is an agency that wanted tools. It funded many experiments. It pushed beyond ethical lines. It hid itself. It then destroyed records. The shape is not a perfect secret machine. It is a network of attempts. Some failed, some harmful, some persistent. Now, to understand the ethics, it helps to name the kinds of subjects who were at risk. Some subjects were employees or associates of the government, like Frank Olson. Some were prisoners. Some were patients in psychiatric hospitals. Some were drug users. Some were people in vulnerable communities. Some were ordinary citizens unknowingly pulled into experiments. A central ethical problem is that vulnerability was not an accident. It was often a feature. A prisoner cannot easily refuse. A psychiatric patient may not be seen as fully credible. A person struggling with addiction may be treated as disposable. When ethics fail, they often fail first against those with the least power. The CIA, like other institutions, had ways to keep responsibility diffuse. A cutout organization could fund a university. A researcher could claim ignorance of the sponsor. A supervisor could claim the details were handled below. A director could claim it was necessary for national security. This diffusion is important because it also shapes how we judge the program. MK Ultra was not only the work of one villain, it was the work of a system. Now, we come to what was found in the 1970s. In 1974, journalist Seymour Hersh published a report in the New York Times about CIA activities inside the United States, including domestic spying and other abuses. This contributed to public pressure. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission examined CIA activities. It looked at the Frank Olson case and other issues. Also in 1975, the Senate created the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church. The committee investigated intelligence abuses. It looked at assassination plots, surveillance, and also mind control research. In 1977, hearings focused more specifically on MK Ultra and related topics. Testimony included discussion of the use of LSD and other drugs without consent. The public learned that the CIA had done things many thought impossible or unthinkable. At the same time, the public did not learn everything. The destroyed records meant that even investigators could not reconstruct all details. This partial exposure is part of why MK Ultra remains a living topic. It is a case where the government admitted enough to confirm suspicions, but not enough to close the book. Now, we will step through some of the specific themes often associated with MK Ultra, and we will mark what is known and what is speculative. First, the idea of a truth serum. The CIA hoped for a drug that could reliably compel a person to reveal secrets. The record shows many attempts. The record does not show a reliable success. Interrogation is complex. Under drugs, people can become talkative, but talk is not truth. People can confabulate. They can speak in fragments. They can be guided by the interrogator. If you want a clean confession, a drug is an unreliable tool. Second, the idea of creating a programmed assassin, a so-called Manchurian candidate. This idea comes from fiction, including a novel and film released in the early 1960s. It echoes earlier fears of brainwashing. Did the CIA try to create assassins? The record shows interest in hypnosis and in the possibility of post-hypnotic suggestion. It shows tests of whether a person could be led to perform acts without later recall. But there is no solid public evidence that MK Ultra produced a reliable method to create an assassin who would kill on command and then forget. That does not mean no one ever attempted such tests. It means the archive we have does not confirm the popular version. Third, the idea of widespread control of the population. Some claims suggest MK Ultra was used to control entire communities, to direct politics, to run mass manipulation. The documented MK Ultra record does not support that scale. The CIA did run propaganda operations and influence operations in other contexts, often abroad. It did run domestic surveillance programs. But MK Ultra, as documented, was primarily focused on individuals, interrogation, and behavior in controlled settings. Again, we do not deny that the government can shape perception. We simply keep MK Ultra in its documented frame. Fourth, the idea of long-term trauma programming. Some survivor accounts describe severe abuse and conditioning, sometimes tied to claims of MK Ultra or related programs. Some of these accounts involve recovered memories or therapy contexts that are controversial. The question of trauma and memory is complex. People can experience real trauma. People can also form false memories, especially under suggestive therapy. The archive shows that officials explored ways to break and rebuild behavior. The archive shows unethical experiments. It does not give us a clean map that matches every later claim. So the responsible stance is careful. We can acknowledge that some abuse happened, that some experiments could cause trauma, and that secrecy could hide crimes. We can also acknowledge that not every dramatic story can be verified. Now let us return to the human side. Imagine a patient in a hospital in the 1950s or 1960s. The patient is depressed, anxious, or struggling. The patient trusts the doctors. The patient enters a world of white coats and closed doors. In that world, treatments could be harsh even without CIA involvement. Electroconvulsive therapy was used, sometimes without the gentle standards of modern practice. Insulin coma therapy had been used earlier. Psychiatric institutions could be places of control. If CIA money enters that world, it does not always need to tell anyone what to do. It only needs to support the kinds of experiments that align with its interests. The patient becomes a subject. Now imagine a prisoner, told to take a pill, or told that cooperation will bring relief, or placed in isolation. Now imagine an unwitting citizen, given a drink at a bar, and then waking up confused, with a gap in memory. These are not fantasy images. They are consistent with what was admitted and investigated. And when we hold them, we feel the moral weight. It is easy, in a story of intelligence agencies, to focus on the dramatic, the spy, the gadget, the intrigue. But the real harm is often quiet. It is a person who cannot explain why their mind feels broken. It is a family that senses something wrong but cannot prove it. It is a life bent by a secret that the state refuses to speak. Now, we will go deeper into the structure of how MK Ultra used external researchers. The CIA used front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. It used foundations. It used grants that looked like ordinary research support. A researcher might receive funding and be told that it came from a philanthropic source. The researcher might not know or might not ask. Some researchers likely suspected. Others may have been fully aware. The record varies. In some cases, CIA documents show that the agency valued plausible deniability. If someone later asked, the agency could say the work was independent. This created a moral fog. Now, consider the broader cultural environment. After World War II, the horror of Nazi human experiments was known. The Nuremberg trials had made clear that forced experiments were crimes. And yet, in the 1950s, American institutions still committed unethical research. The Tuskegee syphilis study continued. Prison experiments were common. Vulnerable populations were used. MK Ultra was part of this landscape. It was not the only ethical failure. It was, however, an ethical failure, with intelligence secrecy layered on top. Now, to keep our narration steady, we can think of MK Ultra as a set of questions. Can a drug make someone talk? Can a drug make someone forget? Can hypnosis create a trigger? Can isolation weaken resistance? Can repeated messaging reshape belief? Can pain and stress produce compliance? Can we protect our own agents from these methods? Can we use these methods against others? Some of these questions are defensive. Some are offensive. Often the line blurred. The archive shows that the agency wanted both. Now we can look at how the program ended, at least on paper. The CIA later claimed that MK Ultra was ended in the early 1960s, with follow-on programs under new names. For example, there were projects called MK Search and MK Often, among others. This pattern, the end of one code name and the start of another, is common in bureaucracy. A program can be rebranded. A budget line can be shifted. So when we say MK Ultra ended, we should be careful. The label may have ended. The interest may have continued. However, the later oversight environment changed. The 1970s investigations brought reforms, at least formally. The intelligence community faced more rules, more reporting, more scrutiny. The damage, though, was done. Now let us talk about one of the most persistent points of confusion, the phrase mind control. Mind control can mean many things. It can mean persuasion, propaganda, advertising. It can mean coercion, threats, isolation. It can mean psychiatric influence. It can mean chemical influence. In MK Ultra, the kind of control sought was mostly about coercion and chemical and psychological disruption. It was not a clean, remote control. It was more like a set of hammers and levers. A hammer can break a person. It cannot always build what you want. This is one of the tragic ironies. If you harm a mind, you do not necessarily gain a tool. You may only gain a broken human. The CIA was not the first institution to learn this. Many interrogators across history have learned that torture and coercion can produce unreliable information. But institutions keep trying, because fear and urgency can override wisdom. Now, some listeners may wonder about specific famous names and whether they were directly involved. For example, was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, part of MK Ultra? He participated in psychological experiments at Harvard in the late 1950s, run by psychologist Henry Murray. These experiments involved stress and humiliation. Some have speculated about CIA ties. There is no solid public evidence that Murray's experiments were part of MK Ultra. It is possible that funding streams overlapped in that era, but the claim is not proven. What we can say is that unethical psychology experiments existed, and some may have been funded or influenced indirectly by broader intelligence interests. Another name is Charles Manson. Some claim he was part of MK Ultra. There is no strong documented evidence for that. Manson spent time in prison and later in a chaotic social scene where drugs were common. The leap to CIA programming is not supported by solid records. Another name is Jack Ruby. Some claim he was a mind control subject. Again, speculation is plentiful, documentation is not. These examples show a broader pattern. MK Ultra becomes a magnet. When an event is shocking, people search for hidden hands. MK Ultra is a ready label. But the responsible approach is to avoid using MK Ultra as a universal key. Now we can still draw a lesson from these speculations. They tell us about public trust. When a government is caught doing secret, unethical experiments, it loses credibility. Later, when it says no, the public does not always believe it. This is a cost of secrecy. It is not only a moral cost, it is a civic cost. Now, let us return to the people who investigated MK Ultra. The Church Committee worked with limited time and limited access. It produced reports that remain important. The Rockefeller Commission also contributed, though some critics argued it was limited in scope. In 1977, the Senate held hearings where survivors and families could speak. The hearings showed the human impact. The CIA, under pressure, admitted some facts. It also defended itself. It argued that the program was a product of its time, that it sought defensive knowledge. But admissions were not the same as accountability. Some victims received settlements. Some did not. Many questions remain. Now, in this quiet archive style, we can move through the timeline again, slower anchoring the key points. Late 1940s to early 1950s. Fear of communist brainwashing. CIA starts Bluebird and Artichoke. 1953. MK Ultra is approved. Sidney Gottlieb leads major aspects. LSD experiments begin. 1953. Frank Olson is drugged without consent and dies soon after. Mid-1950s. Subprojects expand. Funding flows to universities and hospitals. Late 1950s. Sensory deprivation research, hypnosis research, various drug studies. Early 1960s. Operation Midnight Climax and Safe House experiments. 1960s. MK Ultra evolves into other code names. Interest continues. 1973. Richard Helms orders destruction of many records. Mid-1970s. Investigations bring exposure. Surviving financial records are found. 1977. Senate hearings deepen the public record. Now let us consider the ethical reforms that followed. In the United States, human subjects research rules strengthened in the 1970s. Institutional review boards, IRBs, became more standard. Informed consent became a stronger requirement. Some of these reforms were driven by many scandals, not only MK Ultra. But MK Ultra added to the pressure. In intelligence work, oversight mechanisms also expanded. Congressional committees gained roles. Reporting requirements increased. Still, oversight is only as strong as the will to enforce it. The lesson of MK Ultra is that secrecy and fear can erode ethical boundaries fast. Now, the legacy. MK Ultra sits at a strange intersection. It is a real historical program with real harms. It is also a symbol that has been used in fiction and conspiracy narratives. In movies and television, MK Ultra is often shown as a near supernatural technique. A code word triggers a killer. A person is reprogrammed overnight. A hidden lab controls the world. These stories are compelling because they speak to a real anxiety. The anxiety that you are not in control of your own mind. The truth is more ordinary, and in some ways, more frightening. The truth is that institutions can treat people as means to an end. They can drug them, isolate them, harm them, and justify it. That does not require a perfect mind control technology. It requires power. Now, as we continue, we will move through some of the specific techniques studied and what modern science suggests about them. LSD and similar psychedelics can change perception and can increase suggestibility in some contexts. They can also cause paranoia and fear. Under stress, a person on LSD can become more confused, not more cooperative. As an interrogation tool, LSD is unreliable. It can produce information, but not necessarily accurate information. Barbiturates can lower inhibitions and make someone drowsy. They can also impair memory and cognition. Amphetamines can increase alertness and can induce anxiety. Scopolamine, sometimes discussed in popular stories, can cause confusion and amnesia at certain doses, but it is dangerous and not a clean truth drug. Hypnosis can increase responsiveness to suggestion, but it does not turn off moral agency. It does not create perfect obedience. It can create false memories. Sleep deprivation can weaken resistance, impair judgment, and increase compliance. It can also cause hallucinations and cognitive collapse. Sensory deprivation can destabilize perception and increase the desire for guidance. Stress positions, pain, and threats can break a person, but they often produce false statements to end the suffering. Repeated messaging, like recordings played over and over, can affect mood and can reinforce ideas. But rebuilding a personality is not simple, so we see a pattern. Many techniques can harm and influence. Few can precisely control. Now, one of the most important questions is not what tools worked. It is why the program was allowed. In a healthy system, a program that drugs citizens without consent would be stopped. In MK Ultra, secrecy and internal culture allowed it. The CIA had a tradition of autonomy. It operated with limited external oversight. It had a mandate that could be interpreted broadly. Within that environment, officials could argue that extraordinary threats required extraordinary measures, and because the work was classified, the usual checks, like public scrutiny, professional peer review, and legal challenge, were muted. This is why the program is still studied today, not as a manual, but as a warning. Now we can also talk about the way MKUltra has been used in public discussion. Some people use MKUltra as proof that any strange claim could be true. If the CIA did this, then it could do anything. This is a psychological leap. It is understandable, but it is not logically valid. A real scandal does not prove every rumor. What it does prove is that skepticism toward official denials can be healthy. The mature stance is balanced. Believe the documented record. Acknowledge the unknown. Demand evidence for new claims. Resist the urge to fill every gap with the most dramatic story. Now, as the narration continues, we can picture an archive room, a long fluorescent light, a metal table, a stack of boxes. The air is dry. Inside a box, a memo. It is written in plain type, with code names, with budget lines, with words that feel distant. Yet behind each memo is a human scene, a person sitting in a room, eyes wide, feeling time stretch, a patient in a hospital bed, hearing a recording again and again, scientists taking notes, an official signing a paper, a family waiting for answers. The archive is quiet, but the events were not. Now, we will move through several key subproject types that are known. Some subprojects funded research into psychedelics and other psychoactive substances. Some funded research into ways to administer drugs without detection. For example, in drinks, in cigarettes, in aerosols. Some funded research into biological agents. Some funded research into behavioral conditioning. Some funded research into psychological tests and stress. Some funded research into interrogation techniques. One reason the subprojects are hard to map is that many records are gone, but the surviving financial documents show a wide range of institutions. When you see a list of universities and hospitals, it is tempting to assume that each one was knowingly part of a dark program. But funding can be complex. A small grant could support a narrow study. A researcher could be unaware of the true sponsor. So we avoid broad accusation without specific evidence. At the same time, we do not pretend that the CIA only funded harmless studies. The CIA interest shaped what it funded. Now, let us talk about the CIA Technical Services staff more broadly. TSS was responsible for technical support. This included gadgets, disguise, surveillance equipment, and also chemical tools. In that context, mind-affecting substances were seen as tools, like microphones and cameras. This tool mindset can be dangerous. It can reduce humans to targets. Sidney Gottlieb reportedly had a wide mandate. He traveled, he coordinated, he maintained relationships with external contacts. Gottlieb also later retired and lived a quiet life, which adds to the eerie feel of the story. A man who oversaw harmful experiments could later be seen as a mild-mannered retiree. This is another lesson. Harm can be organized by ordinary people. Now let us take a slow look at one of the key moral points: informed consent. Informed consent means a person understands the nature of the experiment, the risks, and the choice to refuse. MK Ultra violated this in multiple cases. Sometimes the violation was direct, like dosing a person without their knowledge. Sometimes it was indirect, like funding an institution in ways that hid the intelligence purpose, affecting what a subject was told. Sometimes consent may have been partial or coerced, like prisoners who agreed under pressure. In modern ethics, these are serious violations. At the time, some officials may have believed that national security justified it, but ethics is not a luxury. It is a boundary that protects people from being used. Now consider how MK Ultra intersected with other CIA activities. The CIA also ran overseas interrogations and detention programs in various periods. In later decades, after 2001, the CIA ran a program of enhanced interrogation, which included sleep deprivation and other coercive methods. Some observers draw a line from MK Ultra to those later programs. The methods are not identical. The legal context is different, but the underlying pattern, the willingness to push boundaries under secrecy, is similar. So MK Ultra can be seen as an early example of a recurring tension. How far will an institution go when it believes threats are existential? How much will it hide? How much will it justify? Now we return to the record destruction in 1973. Destroying records is an act of power. It is also an act of fear. It says, we did things we do not want known. It says, we prefer ignorance to accountability. For historians and citizens, this act is a wound. It prevents full understanding. It prevents full justice. It also creates a vacuum. When a vacuum exists, stories rush in. This is where we can discuss the difference between conspiracy and documented wrongdoing. A conspiracy in the simple sense is just a secret plan by a group. MK Ultra was a conspiracy in that sense. It was secret. It involved planning. It involved deception. But in popular language, conspiracy often implies a totalizing hidden control, a system that explains everything. MK Ultra was not that. It was serious and real, and also limited by human error, scientific uncertainty, and organizational chaos. Recognizing this makes the story more believable, not less. Now, to keep the narration smooth, we will explore several case studies and themes, and let them fade into the background like footsteps down a hallway. Case study: Frank Olson. We already named the core facts. Olson was dosed without consent and died soon after. The government later apologized and compensated the family. The debate about whether he jumped, fell, or was pushed continues in some circles. For our purposes, the key lesson is the reckless use of LSD on an unwitting person. Case study: Operation Midnight Climax, safe houses, sex used as a lure, drugs, observation. This shows a willingness to treat citizens as test material. Case study: Montreal research, funding through fronts, sensory deprivation experiments, psychiatric harm. This shows a willingness to use clinical settings for intelligence interests. Now, beyond these famous cases, there were many lesser-known experiments. Prison experiments where inmates were given drugs. Hospital experiments where patients were exposed. Military experiments where service members were exposed. Not all of these were under MK Ultra. Some were under other programs. The record overlaps. This overlap can confuse the story, so we keep a simple frame. MK Ultra was CIA. It ran from 1953 through the 1960s, with related programs continuing. It involved many subprojects. It included drug and psychological experiments. Some subjects did not consent. Records were destroyed. Investigations in the 1970s exposed parts of it. Now, in the second half of our narration, we will address the bigger question people ask. Did MK Ultra succeed? If success means perfect mind control, no. If success means producing knowledge about how drugs and stress affect people, some knowledge was gained. But much of that knowledge could have been obtained ethically through open research. And much of what was done produced suffering without clear benefit. So the program can be seen as both a failure and a crime. A failure to reach its most ambitious goals. A crime in the sense of violating rights and causing harm. Now let us look at why the CIA was interested in these things. Intelligence work is about secrets. It is about getting information someone does not want to give. In wartime, interrogations can be brutal. In peacetime, espionage can be subtle. But the desire for leverage remains. If you could make someone talk, you could prevent an attack. You could expose an agent. You could gain advantage. This logic is seductive. It tells you that any method might be justified by a future life saved. But the problem is that the future is unknown, and the harm is certain. And the methods often do not work as promised. So the justification collapses. Now, consider the internal culture of an agency like the CIA in the 1950s. The agency was young. It was competing with the FBI. It was competing with military intelligence. It was seeking status. It was also operating in a world where scientific optimism was high. New drugs, new devices, new techniques. In that culture, experimenting with the mind might have felt like modernity. And because it was secret, it could be framed as elite work. This is another hazard. Secrecy can become a form of prestige. Now, we can slow down further and talk about the human mind itself. The human mind is resilient and fragile at the same time. It can adapt to hardship. It can also be wounded. Drugs can change perception. Stress can change behavior. Isolation can change thinking. But the mind is not a circuit board. It is not easily rewritten. This is why large claims about mind control often fail. They assume the mind is simple. The mind is not. Now, you may feel a kind of relief in that. The mind cannot be perfectly controlled like a device. But you may also feel unease, because the mind can still be harmed, and harm can still shape life. MK Ultra sits on that line. Now, as we approach the later part of the story, we can talk about how the MK Ultra story continues into modern times. First, through declassified documents and FOIA releases. Each release adds a piece, a memo, a budget line, a list of subprojects. Second, through survivor stories and lawsuits. Some people sought compensation. Some sought recognition. Third, through pop culture. The name MK Ultra appears in songs, films, video games, and social media. It becomes shorthand for manipulation. Fourth, through contemporary distrust. In an era of misinformation and political polarization, people seek explanations. MK Ultra is a ready symbol. Now we can examine a few specific claims that often circulate and ground them. Claim: MK Ultra used electromagnetic waves to control minds. The documented MK Ultra record focuses on drugs and psychological techniques. There were other research programs in government that looked at radio and brain effects, but the common claim of mind control by waves is not supported by strong MK Ultra documentation. Claim: MK Ultra created mass sleeper agents. Again, no solid proof. The CIA explored hypnosis and suggestion, but the leap to mass programming is not in the record. Claim: MK Ultra continues today unchanged. The codename MKUltra is historical. Intelligence research continues in many forms, but claiming that MKUltra is still running, as the same program is not supported by the available record. What is plausible is that interest in human behavior and influence continues, because those are enduring intelligence concerns, but the specific MKUltra structure belongs to its time. Now, consider another dimension, the boundary between coercion and persuasion. Even without drugs, humans influence one another. Advertising shapes desire, political messaging shapes belief, social pressure shapes behavior. Some people use MKUltra to talk about these everyday influences. That can be useful as metaphor, but it can also blur the specific history. MKUltra was not just persuasion. It involved direct experimentation and harm, so we keep it distinct. Now, in the quiet of this narration, we can also reflect on how societies respond to scandals. When MKUltra was exposed, there was outrage. There were hearings. But then, over time, attention moved on. This is common. Outrage fades. Institutions endure. The archive remains. The question becomes, what lessons were learned? One lesson is the need for oversight. Another is the need for ethical standards. Another is the need for transparency when possible. Another is the need to protect vulnerable populations. Now we can talk about the destroyed records again, because it is central. When an agency destroys records, it is making a bet. It is betting that it will not be held accountable. It is betting that memory will fade. It is betting that even if fragments surface, they can be managed. In MKUltra, that bet mostly worked. There were hearings, but no sweeping criminal accountability. Some individuals faced consequences in reputation, but not necessarily in court. This can feel unsettling, but it is also realistic. Powerful institutions often avoid full accountability. Now, if you feel anger as you listen, that is understandable. But in this quiet archive mode, we let anger soften into clarity. We see what happened. We name it. We do not need to amplify it into myth. We do not need to minimize it into nothing. We simply hold it. Now, we will continue with a long, steady recounting of the known phases, letting each phase settle. In the early phase, the CIA was exploring. It was testing. It was building contacts. It was collecting chemicals. It was looking for leverage. In the expansion phase, it funded many sub-projects. It created safe houses. It experimented with delivery. It explored methods of interrogation. In the rebranding phase, it shifted code names. It continued interest. It adjusted to new priorities. In the concealment phase, it destroyed records. It denied. It minimized. In the exposure phase, it was investigated. It admitted some parts. It withheld others. In the legacy phase, it became a symbol. It shaped distrust. It shaped fiction. It shaped reforms. Now, to bring more detail, we can describe the typical mechanics of a subproject. A CIA officer identifies a research area, a drug, a technique, a lab. The officer seeks a researcher who has expertise. The CIA provides funds, often through a cutout. The researcher conducts experiments, writes reports. The CIA receives the reports, sometimes in classified channels. The researcher may publish some results, or may not. The CIA stores findings. Oversight is limited. This pattern is simple, and it is common in many research funding contexts. What makes MKUltra different is the secrecy and the ethical violations. Now, consider the question of responsibility for external researchers. If a researcher truly did not know the CIA was behind funding, the researcher may still be responsible for ethical treatment of subjects. If a researcher did know, then the researcher shares responsibility for participating. Some researchers may have believed they were helping defend against communism. Some may have been motivated by money. Some may have been motivated by curiosity. Some may have been motivated by ambition. Motives vary. The harm, however, is not erased by motive. Now we will take another slow turn through the Montreal story, because it is often misunderstood. Ewan Cameron was a prominent psychiatrist. He had status. He led professional organizations. He developed theories about mental illness and personality. He believed that mental illness could be treated by depatterning, breaking down the personality and then repatterning it. He used heavy sedation and other methods. He used repeated audio messages. Some patients were in drug-induced sleep for long periods. This was extreme. CIA funding was connected through a front organization. The CIA interest in breakdown and rebuilding aligns with Cameron's methods. But Cameron's work was not invented by the CIA. It was a case where a researcher pursued a radical path, and CIA funding supported it. Patients suffered. This is the key. Now we can zoom out again. MK is often treated as a single line of wrongdoing, but it also exists inside a larger pattern of state power. States have always sought methods to control populations and extract information. Ancient empires used torture. Modern states use surveillance. Propaganda has existed for centuries. MK is one modern chapter. Its uniqueness is in the use of modern psychology and chemistry under intelligence secrecy. Now, another thing that makes MK memorable is the code name itself. MK sounds like a brand. It sounds like something designed. In reality, CIA code names often follow internal systems. MK was a prefix used for certain types of projects. Ultra may have been chosen for effect or classification. The name helps the story travel. Now, we can also think about how the story changes when told by different sources. Official reports may emphasize defensive aims. Journalists may emphasize scandal. Survivors may emphasize trauma. Conspiracy media may emphasize total control. Each frame selects facts. In this narration, we aim for a calm, balanced frame. We acknowledge wrongdoing. We avoid exaggeration. We let uncertainty remain where it is real. Now, we will enter a long segment that describes, in plain language, what coercive influence can do and how it relates to MK Coercive influence often works by breaking routines. It removes familiar cues. It disturbs sleep. It isolates. It creates dependency. It introduces uncertainty. It alternates threat and relief. It rewards compliance. It punishes resistance. It can be done with or without drugs. In MK drugs were seen as a way to accelerate this. A drug could increase confusion. A drug could weaken sense of reality. A drug could make a person more open to suggestion. But again, drugs are unpredictable. So the use of drugs could also backfire. A subject could become violent. A subject could become psychotic. A subject could become non-functional. This unpredictability makes the ethical violations even worse. The agency was not only harming people, it was harming them in ways it could not fully control. Now consider how an institution evaluates such experiments. If a result is messy, the institution may still interpret it as promising. If a subject breaks, the institution may interpret it as progress. If a subject suffers, the institution may not count it as a cost. This is how harmful programs persist. Now, we can gently bring in the question of destroyed records again, because it connects to what we can and cannot know. Many details of MK Ultra are unknowable now. We may not know how many people were dosed without consent. We may not know the full list of subprojects. We may not know the full list of contractors. We may not know the full range of methods. We may not know which projects were serious and which were experiments that went nowhere. We may not know which officials personally approved which acts. This uncertainty is not comforting, but it is honest. Now, sometimes people react to uncertainty by choosing extremes. Either they say, because we do not know, it must have been even worse than we imagine. Or they say, because we do not know, it must have been exaggerated. Both reactions are emotionally understandable. The calm stance is different. We say, we know enough to confirm wrongdoing. We know enough to confirm unethical human experiments. We know enough to confirm secrecy and record destruction. We also know that we do not have evidence for every claim, so we hold the known and we hold the unknown as unknown. Now, we will continue with a longer recounting of the 1970s exposure, because it is part of the arc. In the early 1970s, the US was dealing with Vietnam, protests, and the Watergate scandal. Trust in government was falling. When CIA abuses became public, they fit into this larger crisis. Investigations were launched. The Church Committee revealed many things, not only MK Ultra. It revealed surveillance of Americans, infiltration of groups, and more. This context matters. MK Ultra did not appear alone. It appeared as part of a pattern of secret state action. When the CIA was asked about MK Ultra, it had a defense. It could say the program was old. It could say it was ended. It could say records were gone. This defense was not fully accepted, but it limited accountability. Now, what about the individuals involved? Sidney Gottlieb testified in some contexts and was criticized. Other officials also faced questions, but many were protected by secrecy and by the passage of time. This too is a lesson. Time can be a shield. Now, let us consider the concept of institutional memory. Even when records are destroyed, knowledge can persist in people. An agency can retain methods and attitudes, so the destruction of records may not have erased the knowledge gained. It mainly erased the trace. This is why record keeping and transparency are so important. Now, in the calm of this narration, we can also think about why MK Ultra fascinates people. It involves hidden experiments. It involves altered states. It involves power and vulnerability. It involves the mind, which is intimate. It also involves a confirmed case of government lying. A confirmed lie is like a crack in a wall. People peer through it and imagine what else is behind. Now, we will take a long, slow, almost meditative walk through the key moral questions. What does it mean to experiment on humans? What does it mean to use a person as a tool? What does it mean to claim national security as a reason? What does it mean to destroy the record? What does it mean to apologize decades later? What does it mean for a society to move on? These questions do not have quick answers, but they have a clear center. Humans have dignity. Consent matters. Power must be constrained. Now, we will also address a practical question. How much of MK Ultra is unique to the CIA, and how much reflects wider scientific trends? In the mid-20th century, psychiatry and psychology were experimenting with new therapies. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, was used. Psychoanalysis was popular. Behaviorism influenced thinking. Drugs like chlorpromazine and other early antipsychotics changed treatment. Psychedelics were studied, so MK Ultra did not appear in a vacuum. It used the science of the day. What made it distinctive was the intelligence, purpose, and secrecy. Now, to keep our narrative moving, we will gently shift into a broad recounting of the subproject landscape. Some subprojects sought new chemicals. They looked at compounds that could cause temporary paralysis. They looked at compounds that could cause confusion. They looked at compounds that could cause amnesia. They looked at compounds that could cause hallucinations. They looked at compounds that could weaken will. Some sub-projects looked at delivery, how to put a drug in a drink, how to put a drug on a surface, how to aerosolize a substance, how to dose without detection. Some sub-projects looked at interrogation conditions, how to set up a room, how to use light, how to use sound, how to use isolation. Some sub-projects looked at psychological tests, how to measure stress, how to measure suggestibility, how to measure compliance. Some sub-projects looked at training, how to train CIA personnel to resist interrogation, how to train interrogators. Now, as we list these, it is important to remember that the record is incomplete. We do not have full descriptions of each sub-project, but we do have enough to see the breadth. Now, we will return to the theme of skepticism. Skepticism does not mean disbelief. It means careful belief. When you hear a claim, you ask, what is the source? Is there a document? Is there testimony? Is there corroboration? Is there motive? Is there context? MK Ultra invites skepticism in both directions. Toward official denials, because we know records were destroyed. Toward extreme claims, because we know myths grow in gaps. Now, we can offer a simple method for thinking about MK Ultra claims. If a claim is about the CIA funding drug and psychology research, it is plausible and often documented. If a claim is about dosing people without consent, it is documented in some cases. If a claim is about creating confusion and harm, it is plausible and sometimes documented. If a claim is about controlling a whole society with secret signals, it is not supported by the MK Ultra record. If a claim is about a specific person being programmed, you would need specific evidence. This method keeps you grounded. Now we will continue with a long, calm recounting of the program's moral geography. At the center is the CIA. Around it are researchers. Around them are institutions. Around them are subjects. At the edges are families. At the edges are journalists. At the edges are investigators. The CIA is the source of funds and interest. The researchers are the agents of method. The institutions provide cover and infrastructure. The subjects carry the cost. The families carry the aftermath. The journalists and investigators create partial light. Now, because this is a quiet archive story, we can linger on the idea of partial light. A society rarely gets full truth about secret programs. It gets fragments. It gets disclosures. It gets leaks. It gets hearings. It gets redacted documents. This partial truth is frustrating, but it is also common. MK Ultra is a case study. Now we can continue by exploring how the CIA itself discussed the program internally, as far as we can see. Internal memos often use clinical language. They spoke of subjects. They spoke of dosages. They spoke of results. They spoke of operational utility. This language can feel cold. It is the language of a lab, but it hides the human experience. A person does not experience a dosage. A person experiences fear. A person experiences confusion. A a person experiences loss of trust. So when we read the archive, we translate. We translate clinical words into lived reality. Now the narration continues into a reflection on how such programs begin. They often begin with fear. Fear of an enemy. Fear of being behind. Fear of losing. Fear can be rational. The Cold War had real threats. But fear can also be used. It can be used to justify overreach. MK Ultra shows that. Now, we can also consider that intelligence agencies often mirror one another. If the CIA believed the Soviets had mind control, it would seek its own. If the Soviets believed the CIA had it, they might seek their own. This creates a feedback loop, a race that can lead to unethical acts. Now, do we have evidence that the Soviets had a true mind control method? Not in the sense of science fiction, but we do have evidence that Soviet and other security services used harsh interrogation and psychiatric abuse. So the CIA's fear was not entirely imaginary, but its response crossed ethical lines. Now, we will continue for a long stretch, telling the story in a steady, almost lulling cadence, while still staying factual. In the early 1950s, a memo is drafted. It speaks of the need to explore offensive and defensive techniques. The memo is filed. A budget is approved. A chemist is tasked. A list of substances is compiled. A safe house is rented. A mirror is installed. A bottle is prepared. A subject enters a room. The subject drinks. The subject begins to feel strange. Time bends. A voice asks questions. The subject tries to answer. The subject tries to stay calm. The subject does not know the room is watched. The subject does not know the state is present. Later, the subject leaves. The subject may remember little. The subject may feel shaken. The file is updated. The result is noted. The program continues. In a hospital, a patient trusts a doctor. The doctor proposes a treatment. The patient agrees or cannot refuse. The patient is sedated. The patient sleeps. A recording plays. Again. The patient wakes. Memory is thin. Skills are lost. Family visits. The patient seems different. Years later, a lawsuit begins. A document is requested. The document is missing. A settlement is offered. An apology is issued. The patient is older now. The harm remains. In a university lab, students volunteer for sensory isolation. They are paid. They wear goggles. They wear gloves. They lie still. In the quiet, the mind begins to make its own noise. After hours, they are eager for interaction. Researchers take notes. A report is written. A grant is renewed. The CIA reads the report. It asks, can this be used? The line between understanding and exploitation is crossed. Now, we can notice another aspect of MK Ultra. It relied on the assumption that the mind can be studied like a machine. In the mid-century, this assumption was popular. Behaviorism treated behavior as something that could be shaped through rewards and punishments. Cybernetics explored control and feedback. Systems thinking grew. In that intellectual climate, the idea of controlling a mind did not seem absurd, but real minds are messy. So the program chased a dream. The dream did not fully materialize. The harm did. Now, we can turn to the moment when the program was revealed, because it shows how secrets break. Secrets often break not because someone chooses honesty, but because systems leak. A journalist finds a clue. A whistleblower speaks. A lawsuit demands documents. A budget record surfaces. A commission asks questions. An official slips. In MK Ultra, the exposure was partial and slow. It unfolded over years. It was not a single day of revelation. This slow unfolding is part of why it feels like an archive story. quiet truth emerging from boxes. Now we can also address the moral psychology of those who ran the program. How could they do it? Some likely believed they were protecting the country. Some likely compartmentalized, focusing on technical tasks. Some likely enjoyed the power. Some likely did not think deeply about the subjects. Some likely assumed the subjects would recover. Some likely assumed the subjects were expendable. In human history, many harms have been done by people who did not think of themselves as monsters. That is a hard truth. Now, because we are telling this as a quiet archive story, we can let that truth sit without dramatization. We do not need to imagine cackling villains. We imagine paperwork. We imagine rooms. We imagine ordinary faces. We imagine the banality of wrongdoing. Now, we continue into another long segment, looking at the relationship between MKUltra and the developing field of ethics. After World War II, the Nuremberg Code stated that voluntary consent is essential, but in practice, many institutions ignored it. In the United States, the Belmont Report in 1979 would later outline principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. MKUltra occurred before that formalization, but the basic idea of consent was already known, so the program cannot be excused as ignorance. It was a choice. Now, we can also reflect on the role of classification. Classification is meant to protect legitimate secrets, but it can also protect wrongdoing. When wrongdoing is classified, it becomes harder to challenge. MKUltra shows this. Now, we will continue to fill the time with a steady recounting of the known data, because the length itself can be soothing, like rain, even as the subject is dark. MKUltra had at least 149 subprojects based on later accounting, though the exact number and what counts can vary. Some subprojects involved contracts with researchers, some involved purchase of substances, some involved studies on humans, some involved studies on animals, some involved development of techniques. The CIA used internal approvals. It kept some records. Then it destroyed many. When financial records were found, they showed payments to many institutions. The Senate hearings included testimony that acknowledged the use of LSD on unwitting subjects. The CIA said it ended such practices, but the harm already occurred. Now we can move into a long section about the concept of consent and trust. Trust is a fragile thing. A person trusts a doctor. A person trusts a government. A person trusts a scientific institution. When that trust is broken, it can ripple. MKUltra broke trust. It told citizens, you may be used without your knowledge. It told patients, your treatment may hide another purpose. It told scientists, your funding may be tied to secret goals. Even decades later, this affects trust in institutions. Now we can connect this to the modern world. Today, people debate vaccines, medical research, and government policy. Some distrust is rooted in misinformation. Some distrust is rooted in real past abuses. MKUltra is one of those real abuses. So it is important to understand it accurately. Accurate understanding can help separate justified caution from unfounded fear. Now, we continue into another long, quiet segment where we imagine the archive again. A redacted page, a black bar over a name, a line that says, project terminated, a line that says, records destroyed. These small phrases carry weight. Now, we will address another question people often ask. Why did the CIA destroy records in 1973? The timing matters. 1973 was a time of political stress. The Vietnam War was ongoing. Watergate was unfolding. Helms may have anticipated investigations. He may have wanted to protect the agency. He may have wanted to protect individuals. Again, motives can mix, but the act is clear. Now, in many stories, the destruction of records is treated as proof of the most extreme claims. But destruction can also be a mundane act of cover. It can be done to hide embarrassment and illegal acts that are already serious enough. We do not need to add aliens or supernatural control to make it meaningful. The wrongdoing is already meaningful. Now, let us move into a segment that looks at how MK Ultra was managed internally. Budgeting, approvals, code names, compartmentation. In a secret program, information is segmented. People know only what they need. This reduces leaks. It also reduces moral challenge. If a person only sees a small part, they may not see the whole harm. This is how ethical failure can be distributed. Now, we can consider a simple example. A technician prepares a dose. The technician may not know the subject. A case officer administers it. The officer may not know the long-term effects. A supervisor reads a report. The supervisor may not see the suffering. A director sees a budget line. The director may not see the faces. In the end, no one feels fully responsible. This is dangerous. Now, we can continue with another long recounting of the cultural resonance of MK Ultra. The term appears in music. It appears in internet memes. It is used as a joke. It is used as a warning. It is used to accuse. It is used to explain. Sometimes it is used lazily. Sometimes it is used thoughtfully. The risk of lazy use is that it turns a specific history of harm into a vague symbol. We do not want that. We want to respect the victims by being accurate. Now we will keep moving, maintaining calm. We will shift into a careful review of what the 1977 hearings revealed. The hearings showed that the CIA had funded research into mind-altering drugs. They showed that the CIA had tested LSD on unwitting people. They showed that the CIA had destroyed records. They also showed that the CIA had difficulty accounting for all activities. This is important. Even the agency could not fully reconstruct what it had done. This is what happens when secrecy is combined with poor ethics. You lose control not only of subjects, but of your own record. Now, as we continue, we can explore the idea of institutional self-image. Intelligence agencies often see themselves as protectors. They see their work as necessary. They may see ethical constraints as obstacles. MK Ultra shows how that self-image can distort judgment. Now, we can also mention that some CIA officials later expressed regret, but regret after harm is not prevention. Prevention requires rules, oversight, and culture. Now, we will continue into a long segment that explains, in simple language, why interrogation science is often flawed. Interrogation involves human interaction. A subject may want to deceive. A subject may want to please. A subject may want to survive. A subject may be confused. A subject may believe false things. An interrogator may have bias. An interrogator may lead the subject. Under stress and drugs, these problems increase. So the dream of a truth drug is flawed. The dream of perfect control is flawed. Now, as the narrative continues, we can let the mind rest on the central ethical takeaway. Do not experiment on people without consent. Do not hide harm behind classification. Do not destroy records to avoid accountability. Now, we will fill more time by walking through the later years of Gottlieb and the CIA culture. Gottlieb retired in the early 1970s. He later lived outside Washington. He was not a public figure. He was a man with a private life. This contrast between secret work and quiet life is part of what makes the story feel eerie. Now, we can also consider that many of the researchers and officials involved may have believed they were working at the edge of science. In that era, the edge of science could be reckless. The ethical frameworks were not as mature. But again, basic consent was known. So the excuse of the era only goes so far. Now, we continue with a long segment about how MK Ultra changed the way the public sees government. Before the 1970s, many Americans trusted institutions more. After Vietnam and Watergate and intelligence scandals, trust declined. MK Ultra contributed. It gave a concrete example of hidden abuse. In later decades, this example became part of the background of skepticism. Sometimes that skepticism is healthy. Sometimes it becomes cynicism. Sometimes it becomes paranoia. The difference often depends on whether skepticism is paired with evidence. Now, we can model evidence-based skepticism. We accept that MK Ultra existed. We accept that it involved unethical experiments. We accept that records were destroyed. We do not accept claims that lack evidence. We remain open to new evidence. This is a calm posture. Now, because our script needs to be long, we will continue to elaborate, repeating themes in different wording, without duplicating blocks. MK Ultra was an umbrella term. It was a budget and a set of contracts. It was a set of operational experiments. It was a set of hopes. It was also a set of harms. The CIA wanted a way to control outcomes in interrogation. It wanted a way to protect its own agents. It wanted a way to gain advantage. It pursued drugs. It pursued hypnosis. It pursued isolation. It pursued stress. It pursued repeated messaging. It did not find a perfect key. It did find ways to harm. Now, we can deepen the analysis of one technique: sleep deprivation. Sleep is essential for cognition. Without sleep, the brain struggles to organize memory. Attention collapses. Emotions become unstable. A person becomes more suggestible, more desperate. This makes sleep deprivation a powerful coercive tool. It is also a cruel one. MK Ultra interest in such techniques aligns with later interrogation practices. Now, sensory deprivation. Humans rely on sensory input. When input is reduced, the mind creates patterns. It can hallucinate. It can become anxious. It can lose track of time. This can increase dependence on an outside voice. So sensory deprivation can make a person more open to suggestion, but it can also cause damage. Now, repeated messaging. If you repeat a message many times, it can become familiar. Familiarity can feel like truth. But rebuilding identity is not easy, so the effect may be limited, yet the attempt can still harm. Now we can look again at Operation Midnight Climax, because it combines several themes. It used deception, it used sexuality, it used drugs, it used observation. It shows an interest in compromising people. Compromise is a form of control. If you can record someone in a vulnerable act, you can threaten exposure. This is not chemical mind control, but it is behavioral control. In intelligence work, blackmail and leverage are classic tools, so Midnight Climax fits a broader pattern. Now, some people ask, was MK Ultra only about mind control, or also about assassination and sabotage? The CIA had other programs, like assassination research and special operations. MK Ultra was under TSS and chemical work, so it could intersect with operational tools. But we should not conflate all CIA wrongdoing into MK Ultra. Each program has its own record. Now, let us consider a final key theme. The destruction of records means that we must be humble. We cannot speak with certainty about total numbers. We cannot provide a full list of victims. We cannot provide a full list of subprojects. We can speak with certainty about what investigations found and what documents show. This is enough to tell a serious story. Now we approach the later part of the narration, where we reflect on the meaning of the story in a quiet way. In a democracy, secret programs exist. Some secrecy is needed, but secrecy can also hide abuse. So the challenge is balance. The challenge is oversight. The challenge is accountability. MK Ultra shows what happens when secrecy is unchecked. Now you may notice that this story contains both clear facts and fog. The fog is not an accident. It was created. It was created by classification. It was created by cutouts. It was created by compartmentation. It was created by destruction. When someone creates fog, they should not be surprised when myths grow. Now, in the quiet of this archive, we can end by letting the folders close. We have seen enough to know that MK Ultra was real. We have seen enough to know that it involved unethical human experiments. We have seen enough to know that records were destroyed. We have seen enough to know that the full story cannot be fully recovered. We have seen enough to understand why the name still echoes. Now, as the narration slows, we let the weight lift slightly. You are here, in the present. The archive is behind a glass wall. The lights dim. The voices fade. And the last thing we leave on the table is a simple recognition. Power without oversight can harm. Truth matters. Consent matters. Memory matters. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends. Sleep begins.